On August 29, 1975, a group of Aymara lay and clergy leaders met to discuss the fact that missionaries and the Criollo Mestizo urban Methodist leaders continued empty promises and broken commitments to bring equality and equal representation of the Aymara Methodists in the Methodist Church. This despite the fact that the Aymara were the majority of the church's membership. They were also fed up with the autocratic bishop, who seldom included indigenous in most decisions. After impassioned speeches, the anger of the indigenous Methodists reached full boil. In what has to be one of the most bizarre scenes in the history of all Methodism in the entire world, the indigenous Methodists decided to march into the offices of the IMB headquarters in the Cosmos building and went room to room, beginning with the receptionist, and removed every staff person of the IMB, but made sure that all the records stayed in the office. Here's Herman Crespo telling us what happened that day from a tape recording in 1988 in Tupiza, Bolivia. Before we can understand why a group of Methodist lay and clergy felt they had to forcibly occupy, in the modern sense, occupy the church's offices and force the bishop out of office, we need to know a lot of context. Weaving the Blanket, Stories of Faith, Sacrifice, Martyrdom, and the Emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is Season 3, Episode 0, the introduction to the most controversial Season number 3. The Aymara Revolution within the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia is nearly as controversial, delicate, and polarizing as a conflict within the United Methodist Church today over the issue of gay pastors and pastors doing gay marriages. There are many different strongly held perspectives on what happened and why during the Aymara Revolution. And frankly, there are those who believe that we shouldn't be writing or recording anything about this controversial time. It's just too sensitive. It's just too controversial. It will reopen old wounds and cause conflict between different groups within the IMB and even between different generations. And I know that talking about our own ancestors' faults is never comfortable. But I also know that you cannot and you should not bury history. You must face history and face it honestly in order to not repeat the mistakes of the past and to make steps to heal the pain that it caused. I know because I was born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, USA. And there is a history about Tulsa that was hidden from me and hidden from the world for over 100 years. On May 30th, 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre occurred in Tulsa. Not the Tulsa Race Riot, the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was a bloody, violent attack by white people on Greenwood, which was a black neighborhood just across the railroad tracks from downtown Tulsa. It is believed that Greenwood was the most prosperous black community in the entire United States in 1921 and was called the Black Wall Street. However, economic jealousy and racism combined into the bloodiest attack by U.S. citizens against U.S. citizens since the United States Civil War. Firebombs were dropped from private planes onto rooftops of homes and black-owned businesses. A machine gun was set up by the National Guard, which fired indiscriminately down one street, killing dozens of blacks. Thousands of whites looted and burned and shot blacks indiscriminately. An estimated 1,200 homes and businesses were burned or looted, and over 300 blacks were murdered. This history was immediately hidden from the public. No news agency reported on the event outside of Tulsa. And inside of Tulsa, the reports were sanitized and made to sound much less worse than it really was. All those who were murdered were quickly buried in unmarked graves, with no one saying where those graves are. This event simply vanished from history, and I, as a person who grew up in Tulsa, never, ever, ever heard about this event. That is until a few years ago, as black historians began to gather scraps of information and eyewitness accounts of victims and began to piece together the story. In the last few years, the City Council of Tulsa has spent significant amounts of money to support historians to discover the truth, despite significant opposition from many whites who believed it's ancient history and we shouldn't dig that up. But the City Council has used city crews to go out and dig in various spots looking for the unmarked graves of the dead, and they have vowed to keep doing it until they find those graves. Bringing up this history has, yes, opened up old wounds in Tulsa, and it has been painful, especially for the white community. But by opening those wounds, it has allowed for some beginnings of healing to occur. It has led to some within the white community to admit to the responsibility of our ancestors in this horrible event. It has led to the redevelopment of Greenwood with investments into black-owned businesses in the area and the construction of the multi-million-dollar Greenwood Rising Museum, which tells the story of the massacre and was visited by the President of the United States in May of 2021. I tell you this because I believe that knowing the truth about our past is the best way to avoid making those same mistakes, and the best way to comprehend God's desired future for humanity. Consequently, I believe we should be honest about the facts that led up to and carried through in the Aymara Revolution within the IMB, to be honest about the cultural elitism which led up to it. That means that we will see the strengths and the successes of the U.S. missionaries to Bolivia, and we will be honest about their mistakes and their failures and their weaknesses. We will also see some of the mistakes made by the indigenous Methodist leaders, and I will try to be fair on all those accounts. As I said, Season 3 is by far the most controversial. And there are those who don't think that I, as a North American who hasn't ever lived in Bolivia and who can barely speak a little bit of Spanish, should be the one who's writing this. But no one is really writing a lot about this part of the history of the IMB. And we are losing many of the main actors in history. Bishop Mortimer Arias died in 2016. Bishop Viena passed away last year before I could have a follow-up interview with him about the Aymara Revolution, although I did have one long conversation with him on this topic, which I will be sharing. Bishop Zacharias Mamani and so many of the other indigenous leaders have passed away. I'm not a Bolivian. I've not lived in Bolivia, but I have been coming to Bolivia for over 35 years. I have listened and recorded hundreds of conversations with Bolivian Methodist leaders regarding a great variety of topics, including the Aymara Revolution. And I am simply going to be sharing what I have been told. And I hope someday someone with greater writing and research skills than I have will take this project on and write a more thorough book about these times. In the upcoming 5 episodes of Season 3, we will hear about the events and the stress and the frustrations which led to the Aymara Revolution and the decision to go beyond the simple decentralization of decision-making that was imagined by the United Methodist Church when it granted autonomy to the IMB. These frustrations led to the indigenous pastors and laypeople to physically storm the IMB offices, physically wrestle the IMB away from the Criollo and Mestizo elite, and to gain full emancipation from the United Methodist Church. There are multiple understandings of what happened and why there was an Aymara Revolution. I will do my best to show the actual facts of what happened, or the different version of the facts that I've heard if there's disagreement about those facts. And I will share, particularly in the last episode of this season, the different understandings of what were the motives and the causes for these events. And I will leave it up to you to choose which interpretation you choose to believe. But do understand that I approach this from an Aymara perspective, not from the U.S. missionaries' perspective. Let me also say that I've not done enough research on this topic. I should interview many more people at a much greater depth to get a better understanding of the revolution. I have spent decades talking to people about it. I've spoken to many people about the revolution. I've had various Methodists from various perspectives review these episodes before I broadcast them. But to be a complete and thorough examination of this event would need a lot more research. And the reason I'm stopping now and recording it now is, quite frankly, I've turned 70 years old in January. I've been working on Weaving the Blanket for many hours a week for the last 5 years. And I'm running down and I'm finding it harder and harder to do this work. And if I am up to it physically and COVID settles down, I may come down to Bolivia and interview more folks about the Aymara Revolution and do bonus episodes in the future. But I'm going to lay out the facts of what I have learned so far. I'm going to lay out what different persons have told me about what led up to and created the environment for these events, and I will add my guesses as to why these events happened. But there is a full book to be written here. It just won't be done by me. But I hope that what I've researched will be helpful to anyone who chooses to take this up. I also want to explain what I call cultural elitism. As we have seen, everything in society was organized in Bolivia to get the indigenous to internalize the belief that they were inferior persons and should be happy with their place in the hacienda, patron, peon form of indentured servitude. For many Criollo, the indigenous were not even fully human, but simply farm animals to do the work of the elite. These attitudes toward the indigenous wasn't much different in 1952 than it was in 1570. In fact, S. Rivera, in his 1971 book, Oppressed but Not Defeated, quotes Bautista in saying, quote, "If a lower race is placed next to a superior race, one has to disappear. As LeBron says, we must exploit the Aymara and Quechua Indians to our advantage, or we must eliminate them, because they constitute an obstacle and a delay in our progress. Let us do so frankly and vigorously," end quote. In 1971, this guy was saying that we should eliminate the Aymara and the Quechua because they get in the way of their evolutionary process of humanity. This, of course, is just outright racism. Your race, the color of your skin, makes you superior or inferior. There was a Hispanic Criollo elite. There was the Mestizo half Hispanic, who were partially elite. And there were the peones, or the peons, the indigenous, who knew that their purpose in life was to serve the elite. And this racist attitude was not limited to Bolivia. It may have been even stronger in places like Peru and Argentina, who almost completely wiped out the indigenous populations. There also exists something that I call cultural elitism. Now, I realize that this term has a much more scholarly definition and understanding. But for me, the term cultural elitism means that I don't consider myself better than you because of my race or the color of my skin. But I'm better than you because of the way I was raised, the culture I was raised in, and the way my culture does things. My personal definition of cultural elitism doesn't quite reach the level of the evil of racism, but it certainly approaches racism, is a part of racism, and can feel racist. But again, it's not your race that makes you inferior to me, it's how you do things. I've experienced within my own self many cultural elitist thoughts, which I've tried to overcome, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Beginning on time is a part of my culture. While most indigenous of Bolivia have only had watches, and therefore their lives have revolved around time only within the last 20 years or so. When I first went to Bolivia in 1987, meetings were not at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, but they were in the morning or in the afternoon or after the evening meal. When we handed out medicine, they were to take the medicine not at 8 a.m. or 10 p.m., but in the morning when the sun was low, in the afternoon when the sun was high, and in the evening when the sun set. And for indigenous people, even today, it is far more offensive to cut off socializing and leave a meeting before it is over so that you can make the next meeting on time. That is much more offensive than it is to stay at the first meeting and arrive late to the next meeting. Now, when I led worship in the United States for 35 years, worship began at a specific time and lasted only 1 hour, and God forbid that I should go an hour and 10 minutes. In Bolivia, worship begins when there's enough people there to begin singing, and preaching doesn't start until it looks like most of the people are there. And we stop worship when we're through, whether it's an hour and a half or 3 hours later. Cultural elitism also has to do with how you dress yourself, how often you bathe, what kind of food you eat, how quickly you return phone calls, and today, how quickly you return emails. At first, I and most North Americans maintain a type of cultural elitism, which believes that the Western process is far better. Thus, we are right and they are wrong. We are better than they are, which equals cultural elitism. It's not quite racism, but close to it. But over the last 35 years of working with the indigenous of Bolivia, I have simply come to recognize that it isn't worse than our ways of doing things. It's simply different, with different values and different advantages and different disadvantages. One of the most difficult cultural elitist ideas I've had to rid myself from was my cultural elitist attitudes toward decision making. Indigenous communities make decisions using a completely different system than the Western culture does. I've experienced a lot of that working with the IMB, and I experienced it even more as the founder and executive director of Engineers in Action, or EIA, an engineering nonprofit which brings potable water, sanitation, irrigation, and bridges to remote Bolivian villages. During those years that I was the executive director, I met and worked with Bolivian municipal governments, departmental state governments, directors of the Department of Pachamama, which is a government department similar to EPA, and many smaller indigenous villages communities. In the indigenous culture of Bolivia, maintaining Aini, it's a Aymara word that means community, but more than that, it's community identity. That sense of community is far more important than making a fast decision. Consequently, decision-making is a very slow process. You make sure that everyone gets to speak out on important community issues and community development. The Western culture has a significantly more of a damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead kind of attitude. And if someone or some group can't make a quick and timely decision, then they're just going to be left behind and considered incompetent. For the Western culture, you select a good leader, you follow their lead. If you don't like the way they're leading, then you get a different leader. In the indigenous culture, the leader senses the direction that the community wants to go and then says, okay, let's go that way. Many of our U.S. engineering groups found working with indigenous communities frustrating and slow. One of our jobs at EIA was to explain to engineers that it wasn't the fact that they couldn't make a decision. It's just that they were using a completely different process to make decisions than how it is done in the United States. One isn't better than the other. They're just different. But many, if not most of those engineers, did maintain a type of cultural elitism which believed that the Western process is far better. Thus, we are right and they are wrong. We are better than they are. That is what I call cultural elitism. I will be using the term cultural elitism a lot of times in the next few episodes. Don't take it that I'm calling anybody racist. It's not racism. It's just that persons from the Western culture tend to believe that their way of doing things are better and more modern than the ways of the indigenous. They aren't better. They aren't worse. It's just different. But you will see how the mission boards of the Methodist Church in the United States and many, but not all, of the U.S. missionaries and even the Hispanic missionaries from other South American countries, when they came to Bolivia, were cultural elitists. And they tried to teach the indigenous a better way to live like those in the Western culture. It's not racism, it's cultural elitism. But to be honest, in the previous season 1, episode number 9, entitled James Wimberg, Sent Home Because of His Success at Evangelizing the Indigenous, we heard about the U.S. missionary Reverend John Washburn, who was the district superintendent for Bolivia during the late 1910s to the early 1920s. And we learned how other U.S. missionaries, behind his back, called him the slave trader because he simply held highly racist views towards the indigenous and supported patrons using whips on indigenous farmers if they did anything wrong. Whips. A pastor condoning whipping a peon. So there was clearly in the early years at least one full-on racist missionary, and perhaps there were more. But most missionaries were not racist. However, many, if not most, did carry a certain cultural elitism. This is especially true of the missionaries before 1952. But the late 1950s and 1960s was a time in which God was awakening the world to the evils of racism. And missionaries who came to Bolivia during this time were not racist, but many still carried that cultural elitism. See you next week.